Okay, and here we go. Ready for part two of our lecture on stereotyping Asia. So, if you missed the first part, the first half is mostly administration, where I talk to you about the course assessment, how we're organizing the course, and doing everything online this semester. So, if you want to get back to that, go back to the other video first. I will put a link to that in the description and also in the end of this screen. Okay, so let's jump straight into the lecture content. Okay, so in the previous video also we already talked about our review of Orientalism and talking about how you can think about the representations of Asia and specifically China in this case in Hollywood cinema as a sort of expression of the changing historical relationship between China and America. Okay, so that's Naomi Greene's sort of argument and her methodology. So her methodology is important because it's saying it's like, oh, the representations are not the same. And by looking at how those representations change over time, you begin to see something about the relationship that America conceives of itself for its relationship with China. Okay? All right, so now we're going to talk about what are those types of stereotypes, what are those sorts of representations, okay? So what's a stereotype? A stereotype is a sort of overgeneralization, right, about a particular type of entity, whether that's a person or a thing or, I don't know, animal, right? You could be like, oh, all cats are selfish? I don't know. That's like a stereotype, right? Based upon some type of prefigured convention or standard. Okay, so the idea behind a stereotype is like, think about like if you have a mold, okay? You know, it's similar to these kind of categories, I guess, and you kind of define that category as this type of person does this, this, and this, right? And so a stereotype would then be like, oh, all those people who, you know, are of this type then do those things, okay? And obviously it's an overgeneralization, okay? So, you know, obviously there are racial generalizations, right? Trigger warning, okay? I don't believe any of these stereotypes, and yet at the same time, it's important to discuss them. Okay, to understand how these work as representations. And the reason why I'm giving you this you have to do a midterm assignment where you write a piece of cultural criticism is so that you can sort of draw attention to stereotypes and how they work, okay, and criticize them. And also kind of, you know, and also if you want, you can sort of applaud certain stereotypes as well, if you want to do that, okay? I just want to jump back into that, is that you have a lot of, for the midterm assignment on cultural criticism, I've given you a lot of examples of cultural criticism. Okay, so it's right here. You know, one about the Netflix documentary American Factory, which you'll be watching. One about the Super Bowl and a sign language presentation that was not shown. Another one about Natalie Portman's Oscar cape that honored the women directors of the Academy. Another one about, and I have a couple about Crazy Rich Asians. You know, there was a lot of cultural criticism written by Asian Americans. This is probably a stereotype, okay? But like, I feel like Asian Americans, and this is a stereotype, okay, are like really present on the internet, and they write a lot of cultural criticism. And I've seen articles, you know, research articles talking about how, you know, Asian America itself is born out of like these kind of magazines, you know, where the way that they become united as a sort of, you know, political community is by writing this kind of political commentary and doing cultural criticism. So that's kind of interesting. So think of it as taking part in a sort of, you can even think of your cultural criticism as a sort of ethnic study, right? Of what is it like to be an Asian American, and, you know, looking for representations that malign or support or that are correct, you know, towards your sort of political leanings, if you'd like, okay? Cultural criticism doesn't have to be that way, okay? I'm just saying that that's the type, okay? So what are some examples of cultural criticism? Sorry, cultural criticism and stereotypes are not the same, okay? What are some examples of stereotypes, okay? So I don't think I need to really kind of say these, okay? But there's tons, all right? And obviously Broken Blossoms, you know, is kind of picking up on them, okay? So let's watch the opening scene of Broken Blossoms to see some of the stereotypes in action, okay? The ways that they're, you know, whether they're national, racial, gendered, okay? So here's a stereotype, right, of the kind of the sage, you know, wise, old kind of, let's double speed this, okay? You know, Chinese, you know, monk, you know, who gives advice to his young kind of scholar, you know, it's very Jedi-ish, I guess, you know? And the thing is that, yes, obviously these things do occur in China, okay, and in Asia, or whatever, Thailand, but if this is the only film someone ever sees about China, then they would think that this is what China is all about. Okay, when this is just a very, very small part of it. Okay, not everyone does this. Not everyone is a monk. Okay. Okay, and then this person is like a sort of yellow man, right, who has a dream to go to the West and serve as a missionary, which is really, really strange because that's not what monks do. First of all, they don't go out. Second of all, that's actually a very, very I think the word you're looking for here is Christian thing to do, right? To serve as a missionary. So already, like, what's happening is they're taking on this sort of Christian, story, of a young man who is, innocent and pure and wants to do good work. Okay, all right. So I thought this was interesting, and Naomi Greene talks about this too. Is you have the stereotype of this garrulous, American sailors, right? And so that's a stereotype that's also a stereotype, right, of Americans that, when they get drunk, they start fighting and that thing, especially military young men, right? And then so this young man who, the yellow man, quote unquote, which is really weird too, right? He says, "Do not give blows for blows. The Buddha says, what thou dost not want others to do to thee, do thou not to others." Okay, so first of all, I have no idea whether the Buddha said that or not. Okay, but that's definitely a very Christian thing. Okay, so already this kind of you can see how American kind of Hollywood notions of what is religiously right, what is spiritually or ethically correct, is being placed into the voice of this, purportedly, Asian or Chinese character. Okay, so this is part of what Naomi Greene is saying is like, even these would be considered stereotypes are being shaped by what people want to see, what kind of they're interested in these kind of identifiable characters. And yet, okay, but what are the other sort of stereotypes that this actor, who's not even Chinese, right, is kind of like playing up, right? One is he's dressed up in yellow face, right? So what are this kind of stereotypes, right? So the stereotype here is these sailors, they dress in this kind of sailor, like it's more like little boy clothes, okay? And then he, as a young man, is dressed up in his, formal regalia with like a rice farmer hat, right? Why is he wearing a rice, like a farming hat if he's like out on the street or whatever, right? But this is how stereotypes form, especially because a film like Broken Blossoms was a huge hit all over the world. It made tons of money and a lot of people watched it. And a lot of people, their only kind of understanding of, Asian, its representation, was from a film like Broken Blossoms. Okay? So, fighting American sailors, right? Another stereotype, right? So, but the sensitive yellow man shrinks in horror. So think about the way that this is phrased here, right? The sensitive yellow man shrinks in horror. Because it's called yellow man, right? This individual, even though he's not played by a Chinese person, comes to stand in for all, quote unquote, yellow men. Okay? So already this person is a gender stereotype and a racial stereotype and a national stereotype. Okay? So what happens, okay, is that this becomes the mold. This becomes the stereotype that others are judged against, So a lot of, Asian Americans, and personally, like, yeah, I grew up with this, but now I don't think it's that big of a deal. But it's like, they'll be like, oh, everyone always said, or ask me if I'm like Bruce Lee, because that was the stereotype of Asian men. Are you like Bruce Lee? Do you know Kung Fu? Okay. But it's like, is that stereotype really around? Is that really the major thing anymore? It almost seems to me like that's a sort of something that gets kind of beaten into it in our cultural criticism. But maybe that's because I read way too much cultural criticism. But the idea I'm trying to say is no one who is part of that group likes to always be compared to a stereotype, especially when it doesn't even fit. And even if it does fit to some extent, it doesn't fit that well. Or there are things that are not always true. Right? So for example, like let's say, I consider myself like a sensitive man. I don't know if I'm young anymore, but yes, like the sociable free fight for the Jackies. Okay, the Jackies are the Americans, right? They're sociable, they're free, and they fight, right? So that's a stereotype of white men, right? Of white Americans. So if you think of it as a stereotype, then it's like, oh, can a white man be sensitive? Can he be peace loving? Right? And then can a yellow man be sociable? Can a yellow man want to fight? Can a yellow man want to be free-loving? Okay? And here the yellow man shrinks in horror, right? So the yellow man is yellow, right? He's a coward, right? So it's not so much that, it's not about it's not just, okay? It's not just about whether it's positive or negative, okay? And I think a lot of cultural criticism would be like, oh, and maybe this is a remnant of, the 80s, 70s, okay? Where it's like, oh, we need more positive representation. We need more positive representation. So if the yellow man is represented as sociable, free, and, loves to fight, is that a good thing or a bad thing? But I think that the kind of argument against all of these kind of stereotypes is that if you paint with a broad brush, it's always going to be inaccurate. And the people who are being painted as such are always going to feel offended, and, not like it's fair, right? And, obviously it's even more kind of insulting, right? If the person, right, the yellow man more than ever convinced that the great nations across the sea need the Buddha, okay? And see, the thing is that the people who are thinking this is not, like, first of all, when people in China left during the 19th and 20th century, they didn't leave because they wanted to go to the West and bring them Buddha, okay? They left because there was more opportunity. They wanted to make money, all right? They wanted to be able to feed their families, You had a lot of what they call internal kind of pressure out because of, civil unrest, famine, that kind of thing, calamity. So you have a lot of people from the coastal regions, right, that are all leaving, right? And these are the people that people in California, people in London, people in Southeast Asia are meeting. These people who, are willing to get onto a boat, sign a contract, and just go places just to work. Very similar to the migration that we're seeing today. Okay, and so there's a lot to talk about with that with regards to the yellow peril myth. And I'll try to talk about that today, but it's a lot to cover, so we'll keep getting into that, okay? But anyway, who actually is taking it upon themselves to bring about this kind of peace and love that's, religious spirituality, right? And that's especially during this time period in the 1910s, right? Is the white Americans. Okay, white Christian Americans, they see themselves as part of a civilizing mission that they need to go to China, right? So this person, okay, even though he's supposed to be a yellow man, is really a representation of what many would consider to be the best intentions of the kind of white liberal American kind of West. Okay, and they might even see it as progressive, okay? So that's another thing that it's like, one, this stereotype of the yellow man, one is that he's, effeminate, okay, non-sexual, right? And this is important, right? It's important that he's non-sexual, and we'll get into that, okay? Non-sexual, okay, innocent, pure, okay, well-intentioned, okay, kind of cowardly, right? But also that even then, people are seeing this as an accurate representation of China, but the person who's playing that role is not even Chinese. Okay, it's a white actor, and sometimes oftentimes actually, the actors were not Americans. They would be like Swedish, like Werner Oland. I think he was the main actor who played Charlie Chan. He was actually Swedish, I think. So there's always like, oh, they're gonna find someone who's slightly, a little different from American, but not too different. Okay, and so you have these people dressed up, like in a costume, putting tape on their eyes so that they look, more yellow, or what they call later on, they call him chinky, something like that, right? Okay, the yellow man. Okay, so there's something about this, and there's also something about his mannerisms, right? Like the acting. Okay, yes, it's very, very theatrical and gesture ridden because it is silent cinema. And during silent cinema, a lot of the acting and the emotiveness comes out of these kind of bodily expressions. So the way that he's playing as Chineseness is one who's always kind of cramped up. He's squeezing his shoulders, kind of, holding himself kind of in a sort of fearful way, hugging the walls, that kind of thing, okay? So this is the way that, that portrayal is kind of happening, okay? So you can see why, at least for some, people who grew up in the 50s or something, 60s, when they have someone who's like Bruce Lee who comes out and is like, I'm not afraid, and his bodily expression is very powerful, very strong, it's seen as like, yeah, this is empowering, okay? But as Naomi Greene would say, the pendulum just keeps swinging back and forth, okay? All right, so back to our PowerPoint, okay? So yes, the point is that for Broken Blossoms is a very positive representation, but then at the same time, that positive representation is still different enough, okay? Different enough that people can accept it, right? So for Broken Blossoms, at once a hymn to racial tolerance, okay, right? So it's like, oh, Chinese people are okay too, right? And let me get into this, okay? D.W. Griffith is, okay, those of you who have heard of him know that he is one of the most important filmmakers of all time, okay? And his most famous film is a film called Birth of a Nation, and I'm going to talk about that, all right? The Birth of a Nation kind of invented the feature film. It was the first blockbuster. It was the first big major film that used these long scenes, action scenes, kind of heroes, and melodramatic kind of pathos in order to accelerate action. Okay, so it's really, really important film. And yet at the same time, it's incredibly racist, okay, because it's about heroizing the Ku Klux Klan. And kind of talking about, and it makes all these kind of representations, has tons of, characters that are African American in blackface. It makes it seem as though, like, abolition was actually a terrible thing because it endangered the young, innocent white women. Okay, so after The Birth of a Nation came out, right, there was a lot of criticism about the film and how it was really negative. Its portrayal is really negative, and so Griffith took that kind of really badly. And then he made another film called Intolerance, which is all about how people were very intolerant of his art. Okay, but actually it's also a big budget film about, ancient civilization. I forget which one. Okay, so yes, D.W. Griffith is also one of the first kind of auteurs who makes all his movies about himself. Okay, so Broken Blossoms was actually a very, very small budget film for him. And it was really kind of his ode to, okay, see, I can tell a story where everyone gets along and where, I don't malign kind of people racially, and so even the yellow man gets represented as good, okay? And he even used, okay, I'll talk about this in a second, okay? But at the same time, right, and this is what Naomi Greene is saying, a film that exalts a Buddhist message of love and compassion, yet gives this message an unmistakable Christian cast. A work that praises universal brotherhood, yet endows this Chinese character with unalterable marks of difference. Okay, so you are the same as us. You are Christian, but only to a certain extent. An extent that a lot of Asian American kind of cultural criticism and scholarship, especially in the early stages, was always about. It's like we are unassimilable. Okay, even though we can be Christian, we can represent all of the best values of white American society. There still needs to be something that marks us off as different. And why? Why is that? Okay. So another thing that's very important to think about, with Broken Blossoms is that the yellow man is asexual, right? So here we go. Sexual ambiguities and denials that run through the film and surround its protagonist. Here, reality itself disappears, even as marks of difference are both denied and affirmed. Both the fascination and the threat, okay, of sexual difference are unmistakable. Okay, the yellow man is at once someone who burns with sexual passion and the most chaste of lovers. Just as his Christianity is both challenged and affirmed, he is at once a heathen and a man whose words and deeds vibrate with Christian ardor. So too is his sexuality. Here, pleasure comes from the denial and disavowal of pleasure. Okay, I think Okay, so does this remind you of anything? Okay, so what was the most popular kind of like sex novel of the past 20 years? Okay, it was what's it called? 50 Shades of Grey, right? 50 Shades of Grey. And 50 Shades of Grey, has a very, very similar type of storyline, okay? Now, let's jump that back. Where did 50 Shades of Grey come from? It was a piece of fan fiction, right, written by a fan of Twilight, okay? And what is Twilight? Twilight is a book about a teenage vampire and his teenage, innocent, young, virginal girlfriend, right? And this teenage vampire burns with the desire to, consume his girlfriend. I don't know. I've never seen it. Okay. And yet there's a threat, right? And so he has to push himself to not act on his, carnal desire. But at the same time, there's something very, very sexy about the fact that he's holding himself back, yet wants her so badly, right? His words and deeds vibrate with Christian ardor. Okay, so the pleasure here comes from the denial and the disavowal of pleasure. Okay, there's something very, very much about cinematic about this, right? Like those of you who are interested in talking about sex on screen, I highly recommend Linda Williams is screening sex, okay? But in this particular type of manifestation, there's something very, very sexual about this asexual Asian, okay? I was going to talk a little bit about yellowface and whitewashing, but I feel like that's something that, maybe you can talk about that in the what's it called? In the discussion forums, okay? And yellowface and whitewashing, all right? But yeah, I don't want to take up too much time because I've already lectured for a long time already, and there's still a lot to get through. But I think that you all are well aware, or of this, especially because of the cultural criticism that gets written. Okay, all right. Yes. So there's something very, very kind of sexual about the fact of this this yellow man's ardor. Okay, all right. So let's look at those scenes of his ardor. Okay, look at the way he kind of fawns over. Okay, so if you haven't watched the film, watch the film. Okay, but the basic storyline is this young woman. She's I don't know if she's a young woman or she's a girl. Okay, but she's young. She's young and innocent and virginal. That's the point, right? And her dad is okay. So trigger warning. Her dad is abusive, very abusive. Okay, and so one day she wanders after getting abused by her father, who is a stereotypical, right? Stereotype, drunken brute who fights on the streets and stuff like that. Okay, and he does this prize fighting and he beats his daughter. Okay, so that's a stereotype of the lower class, right? Of lower class masculinity. All right, so the film is full of stereotypes, but films are how stereotypes get made and spread. I think that's kind of the point. All right, so let's look at his devotion to his young. He tries to protect her, and yet he's got this kind of sexual leaning, but he turns himself away, right? And yet this kind of love that he has for her, this sexless love that he has for her, kind of brings her around again. It kind of saves her. It's like a sort of salvation for her, okay? And yet he's not going to act on that sexual kind of devotion for her, right? And she's going to remain chaste and pure, okay? And look at the way he kind of fawns on her and takes care of her, okay? Her beauty so long hidden shines out like a poem. So his kind of devotion and love for her brings out the kind of love in her, right? So he's devoted to her, and yet he can't act on it fully, right? Look at the way he kind of chews on this thing, tries to hide his kind of sexual, desire for her in order to protect her in some sort of way. And there's something supposed to be that's very, very kind of holy or good about this, right? But also, I think that some people would argue that, part of the pleasure of watching this, okay, is that tension. Okay, this tension going back and forth of I love you, but I will not, and I sexually desire you, but I will not act on it. Okay, and this is a sort of, this is a kind of back and forth movement between desire for and repression of. And that actually can be seen as something that is considered, I don't know, this kind of sounds kind of weird. It's getting a little too sexual, but already, I think that's part of the argument that both Naomi Greene and also Gina Marchetti are making, is that it is very sexual, and it is kind of like foreplay. It's kind of like this want but don't want but will hold back. Okay, that is part of the melodrama. Okay, so let's see. We are going to talk about melodrama, right? So melodrama is a particular type of storytelling convention, okay, that is often used as a form of moral parable, okay, that kind of teaches or negotiates, and some people say it's like a way of society talking to itself about what are the correct rules of etiquette, okay, and yet at the same time, melodrama it activates this sense of morality by playing up and kind of intensifying feelings. So melodrama is really about emotional satisfaction. So even action is very, very melodramatic in that it's trying to kind of, you can say, tug at your heartstrings. Some people will say that, right? And how do you do that? So it's not just about telling a story that's very, very heart-rending, right? It's also about using these kind of cinematic, and in this case, I guess I'm talking specifically about cinematic melodrama, but melodrama is a narrative mode that gets used in a lot of different types of media. So, even a video game can be melodramatic. Okay. Even obviously literature, theater. Okay. But melodrama is kind of like creating a sort of excess of kind of excessive feeling that you would then interpret for a sort of moral. So when people ask you what's the moral of the story, that is a sort of melodramatic interpretation of something. Okay, when you're looking for, oh, what's the meaning that we take from it, right? But the way that that meaning is gauged is through feeling, right? And so part of what makes melodrama popular is because it feels good to feel, right? There's something very, very satisfying about going through this kind of emotional back and forth, okay? And so the emotional back and forth of, like this young man, who loves this woman, but he cannot be with her because he's too Christian, even though he's Buddhist or whatever, right? And holding back is kind of very melodramatic, this kind of push and pull. And then that push and pull is also happens through action too, right? There's always this sense of kind of like a very kind of common melodramatic trope is like a countdown, where you have like this kind of timer that's going down, and there's and it's this kind of oscillation between just in the nick of time and too late, and you want the character to get there just in time, or if it's too late, and it's not so much, it's the importance is not whether or not, like, okay, in the narrative, yeah, it's important whether or not that hero or whatever gets there in time. And D.W. Griffith pretty much invented this kind of trope, right? Maybe, serious film studies historians will argue with me. I don't know, okay? But at least the way I was taught to understand melodrama is D.W. Griffith created this through editing, okay? Using editing to create this sense of time and this kind of countdown where it's going to be too late and you're not going to get there in time, right? And it's like in the narrative, yeah, it matters whether or not they get there in time. But for the film, the point is that to get that sense of tension, and that raised, heightened kind of feeling because of this danger, this threat, of getting there or not going to get there, okay? So obviously you see this in Broken Blossoms, right? So in Broken Blossoms, the lowering storm, okay? So, boxer man, dad who's a jerk, and beats his daughter, has found out that his daughter is holding up with the Chinaman who's taking care of her, and he's, and so he's gonna go get her, right? And he's gonna, beat her up, right? So here you have the creation of the situation. Oh no, the young hero is leaving her all alone, right? So you have these kind of parallel storylines going on at the same time. And Griffith was the first to sort of create this sense, like, how do you know that these things are happening at the same time? This is something that was really new. Okay, it's a trope now for us to understand that if you see something like this, even though they're taken at different places, it's something that's happening at the same time. But that was a sort of cinematic intervention and creation. Sorry, cinematic invention. So, oh, he's going to do something really, really nice. But little does he know, right, that the young maiden, is in danger. So while she's away, these ruffians while he's away, the ruffians go and get her, right? And so this is the creation of a sort of dangerous situation, right? And then he needs to, here, I'm going to accelerate it. I'm going to move it a little faster so that we can kind of get through it. So 2x speed. Okay, all right? And then, oh no, the bad guy has discovered her, and now the situation gets really bad, right? So look at their faces, right? This is the kind of creation of the tension. Is he going to hit her? Is he going to hurt her now, right? You with a dirty chink, right? So now it's the creation of that, the start, okay, of the pathos, of the acceleration, right? So notice the shots get more and more intense, right? Right? And then there's the bargaining, the back and forth, right? And so the key, at least here, is, and the kind of real kind of cinematic mastery, that makes Griffith, one of the first great auteurs, is that he generates this tension, and he tries to hold on to it and keeps the audiences listed, right? So it's like, where's the hero? Where's the villain, right? And it's kind of going back and forth, right? And so it's like, how long will it take, for him to come back in time, right? In order to, save the day, okay? So he kind of tries to keep it going for as long as possible, right? And then that's an evil Asian, okay? Evil Asian. Okay, where is he? Where's the evil man? And now he's discovered, oh no, is it too late? Is it too late, right? Oh God, what am I going to do? I have to save her, right? So he has to, and then she's about to, okay, so here's a famous scene. Here's a very famous scene. Oh, what's he going to do, right? So he has to go save her. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So the idea is to, to make the audience feel and to accelerate that feeling. Okay. So this is the famous scene where she's locked inside of a closet, right? And there's no way out, right? And so this was seen as like a masterpiece of Lillian Gish's acting, right? Where she try to hold off as long as possible, try to protect herself, and she's kind of like a mouse that's locked inside a cage, and this kind of fear and terror, right? And then he, as if psychically, knows it's like, I have to rescue her, I have to save her, right? And so you get a gun from whatever, okay? Will he get there in time? Okay, so this was all really, really new. This was like I don't know, real cinematic innovation at the time. Okay, so he gets so angry, and then anyway. So I hate to say this, okay, and this sounds kind of weird, and don't. Part of the criticism that people are making is that it's kind of like it's part of a fantasy too, to have this kind of like fear. And even though this is kind of terrible and it's torturous to see a little girl who's about to get killed by her father, which is really devastatingly terrifying, audiences enjoyed this. They enjoyed the feeling of fear, that feeling of horror, right? So you see the hatchet coming through, right? Where else have you seen that, right? That was referenced in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, right? Like where Jack Nicholson's character breaks through the door with the hatchet, right? To kill his wife and son. Okay, so that's also a Hollywood stereotype, right? Breaking through the doors, right? So this is crazy action, right? And then he gets to her, and then he first he's gonna beat her, and then she tries to beg him not to beat her one more time. It's kind of phallic too. I hate to say it, right? And then, but is it too late? And yeah, it's too late. I'll show you. I've shown you, right? And so the assumption is that you killed her, right? But we don't know for sure if she's dead or not, okay? And that's another thing about melodrama, right? Melodrama is like, is he too late or is he in time, right? And so it's always trying to extend that intensity, trying to maintain that kind of feeling, right? So he sneaks in, he's like, and he discovers, is she still alive? Dying, right? Okay, so it's that last moment. Can he get to her in time? Can he save her? Or will she see him, Like, another film that does this, and I talk about this in my scholarship, is like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, right? Where it's like, will you get there in time with the antidote or not, right? So it's a very long Hollywood convention, okay? So, as she's dying, as she lays there dying, and how long can you die for, right? Okay, so that's a melodramatic trope, okay? And did he get there in time, yes or no? Okay, all right. So then, anyway, and then for someone to be dead, someone has to discover that they've died, okay? It has to be registered in some sort of way. Okay, so all of these kind of tropes come from early cinema. Okay, these kind of conventions, right? So then the major conflict. Okay, and then they're gonna attack each other. Okay, all right. So that's from Broken Blossoms. All right. So that's the use of melodrama in what might be considered a sort of positive way, right? Where the evil villain is a white man, right? But he also is a lower class kind of stereotypical, stereotyped as a ruffian drunkard who beats his children. Okay. But at the same time, you can see that this same type of use in Birth of a Nation, right? Which was really the first one to really kind of like, create this sense of tension through this chase scene, right? Okay, so in Birth of a Nation, the same actress, Lillian Gish, is the little girl, right, who's innocent, and her older brother, right? And it's always, not always, but in these cases, the stereotype is that is a young woman who is not reached the age of marriage. Okay, still too young, okay? And she goes out against the best of advice. And she goes out to the well to get water, right? And then, while she's going out to water, the dangerous, former slave who's too uppity, right? So I'm using stereotypes here, but in a critical way. But I don't know if that's actually a good thing. Notices her, and he begins to follow her, right? Of course, it's a white actor dressed up in blackface. He's also a union representative, a union soldier, right? Starts tracking her down. Okay, so let's accelerate. Okay. All right, so she's innocent, frolicking, and he's gonna find her. And what's he gonna do when he finds her? So here, the sexual threat, right, and kind of tension is created by this fear of racial miscegenation, this fear of the sullying of the purity and the whiteness of this little girl, and then you have the older brother, right, who's gonna rescue her, right, and he's the sort of hero, right, and so it's like she's moving and then he's following, right, the bad guy's following, and then the hero's following in behind, right, and he's noticing the clues. Will he rescue her in time? Okay, so melodrama creates this kind of tension, right, and so I guess my argument would be, and I think that, and I'm basing a lot of this on Linda Williams's work, so I'll give you a reference in Moodle. It's not just that it's about race, okay? Because, it's about using race to intensify melodrama, okay? So it's already melodramatic because of the convention, right, of threat and fear and anxiety, but also enjoyment and pleasure. Okay. At the same time, by adding race and sex, okay, and this is very intersectional, right? It's not just race; it's also sex and gender, right? Adding that into the mix adds fuel to the fire. It makes it more passionate. It makes it more threatening and more anxiety-ridden, okay, and therefore makes it more popular. Gets more people in seats, right? So instead of succumbing to the African American, she does the quote unquote right thing and kills herself instead. Okay, and this was also in another movie that did this was Apocalypto. I don't know if you watch Apocalypto, but Apocalypto, Mel Gibson's film about about I guess it was Mayan civilizations and how the Mayans, the rich, powerful Mayan kind of city-state group would go in and invade and kill off the kind of villagers and the natives that were close by. And, there were chase scenes, and this question of, did my wife, did she succumb to this villainous brute or did she kill herself? That kind of thing. Okay. And that all these stereotypes, right? These kind of what Gina Marchetti calls narrative patterns, okay, come out of early cinema and a lot of it out of theater as well. Okay. All right. So melodrama. So melodrama then is a sort of moral parable, okay? Melodrama has proven key to understanding the ways in which American mass culture, quote, talks to itself about the relations between race and gender. It is through this Manichaean logic of good and evil. So Manichaean means, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, okay? It means kind of like very polarized, very clearly black and white, okay? Logic of good and evil, and the victim and villain, the melodrama recognizes virtue. So by creating this kind of tension, it becomes very, very clear what is good and what is bad. Who is innocent, who is evil, okay? And expresses the inexpressible and reconciles the irreconcilables of American culture. So what Greene, Williams, and Marchetti are all saying, and this is why they're film scholars, they're not cultural critics. They're not saying, this is or is not racist, this particular representation, or it is progressive or not progressive, or good for our politics or not good for our politics. The point that they're trying to make is they're trying to understand how this particular narrative convention works and how it illustrates the ways that society and popular culture functions to determine and kind of express and negotiate our cultural politics. Okay? This is really important because what she's saying is that melodrama itself is very, very problematic because it creates a binary of good and evil when, in order to it does this not just because, people want to understand or have a position on something like race or abolition or later on things like suffrage, and even today, we still have a lot of racial melodrama, right? Like the Green Book, okay? And, even this story of Parasite winning Best Picture, it's like, finally, the Academy, which has been, full of bad people who have, been protecting their interests, finally, awards the innocent virtue of international filmmakers who have been shut out of the Academy for so long. Even that is itself a sort of racial melodrama that's played out in public discourse and advocated by cultural criticism. Okay, so my argument, and I think maybe Linda Williams will back me up on this, but my argument would be a lot of cultural criticism is also melodramatic, or uses these kind of melodramatic kind of tropes. And this is part of the argument that I make about in my own research. So I have an essay coming out this summer. So, if you're still interested, you can read that later, where I talk about melodrama, and it's linked to nationalism. Okay? All right. So melodrama then is a sort of popular discourse of morality, neither an inherently racist nor anti-racist form. Okay, so melodrama is not racist or anti-racist. It's a way to negotiate social issues and make it into a moral parable. Okay, but ultimately, and melodrama scholars would argue back and forth about this. The function is not to, make a statement. Although making statements is important, I think, for a lot of people and a lot of scholars, and people will look for that meaning, in the story and try to say what it means for cultural politics. But ultimately, the function of melodrama is to make audiences feel things in order to get them to go to the movies and watch movies and enjoy them. Okay, so there's a pleasure in melodrama, and that pleasure makes a lot of money. All right. So, like the quest for moral legibility, is also a very, very enjoyable thing. Like when you go to watch a melodrama, all the kind of confusion of real life, the complications actually become very, very clear. Okay. And that's not because these things are actually really, really clear. It's actually because melodrama is a form that purposely tries to distill this virtue and make it something that you can pleasurably enjoy. Okay, another interested in melodrama. Another couple scholars you definitely should read is Christine Gledhill, and oh my gosh, how could I forget? Okay, the melodramatic imagination. Peter Brooks, yes, Peter Brooks. Okay, and the melodramatic imagination. Okay, Peter Brooks talks about it more in terms of literature. Okay, but anyway. All right, so there's a lot of scholars on melodrama. Okay, all right, so yes, but what stands behind them? So melodrama. Okay. The quest to forge and viscerally felt. This is key, viscerally felt. So it's kind of like melodrama, instead of thinking about what is right and wrong, it kind of activates a way of feeling what is right and wrong. Okay? Especially in the midst of moral confusion and disarray. So that's why a lot of these kind of popular discourses that are very difficult to kind of reason out, and cause a lot of trouble during the time, get made very, very clear and simplified, and not necessarily in a way that is right or wrong, but at least is kind of narrated that way in melodrama by using feeling to kind of make it the experience of sensation and feeling becomes a way to interpret what is right and wrong. Okay. So melodrama is organized around a paradoxical quest for full articulation of truth and virtue at precisely those junctures where are most vexed. Okay. So it's like looking for truth and virtue where it's something that's much more complicated than that. And melodrama really simplifies that, not just because it is simplifiable, but because it's pleasurable to do so. Okay? All right. So let's get to Gina Marchetti's argument. All right? So Marchetti argues then that her methodology is not just looking at the particular representations, but looking at the narrative patterns specifically around a particular narrative trope, which is racial miscegenation, specifically between Asian women and Caucasian males. Okay, I flipped that. Okay, actually, it's both. I'm sorry, it's both. Okay, we'll talk more about the reverse later. But this idea of racial mixing between Asian and not Asian, or American and Chinese. Okay. Asian Caucasian sexual liaisons, how they work ideologically. Okay, so how they kind of create value systems or support or uphold particular value systems to uphold and sometimes subvert culturally accepted notions of nation, class, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So there's something very, very special at this intersection of race and gender. okay, related to this kind of idea of romance between yellow and white, quote unquote, okay, that it becomes a sort of very, very interesting and valuable way to understand ideology, Hollywood ideology, but American popular culture's ideology and its and its under its beliefs or what it tries to advocate as a belief about the relationship. Okay, so her book Romance in the Yellow Peril, which is also our required text, okay, talks about the yellow peril. Okay, so the yellow peril is a sort of trope, right? And first started as a sort of literary trope, and the idea is that there is a yellow peril, and the yellow peril is these Asiatic people who will come and destroy the Western European civilization. So it's a peril, right? And even this term peril is very, very like it is melodramatic, right? This kind of threat. Right, one of the most famous melodramas, and the reason I say this just comes to mind is like this film called The Perils of Pauline, okay, which has like this woman on an ice floe, and she's in peril, right, and you have to rescue her, right. And so with the yellow peril, then what is in peril? In peril is supposed to be this white European Western civilization, and the threat is the yellow peril. Okay. Now, originally, this yellow peril was seen as like Genghis Khan, right? This threat of like this dangerous barbarous horde, kind of like, as if the characters in Grass, which you watched for the previous lecture, are actually leaving their area and going all the way to the west and invading, right? So how do you articulate that peril in a way that's most scary? Okay, it's that peril specifically goes for its representation in like the white Western woman. And her purity and innocence will be defiled, right? And so the peril is very, very sexual, okay? So let's see. So I'll just read from Marchetti here. For the most part, Hollywood's depiction of Asia has been inextricably linked to the threat of the so-called yellow peril. Rooted in medieval fears of Genghis Khan and Mongolian invasions of Europe, the yellow peril combines racist terror of alien cultures, sexual anxieties, and the belief that the West will be overpowered and enveloped by the irresistible, dark, occult forces of the East. Okay. Given that knowledge about Asia and Asians has been limited to Europe and America, much of this formulation necessarily rests on a fantasy that projects Euro-American desires and dreads onto the alien other. So again, this is a sort of, part of the Orientalist kind of notion that it's a projection of Europe. So the yellow peril is really not about Asia. It's really about America or European America, right? And this is also anyway, okay. So Marchetti doesn't directly quote Said, and I don't think she needs to really, because Said is also building on Foucault, which and Foucault's arguments about discourse, which Marchetti also does. Okay, so thus, as Western nations began to carve up Asia into the colonies, their own imperialist expansion was in part rationalized by the notion that a militarily powerful Asia posed a threat to Christian civilization. So, in order to stop the peril, you need to go and destroy Asian civilization and make everyone aware of that perilous danger. Okay. Yeah. So one of the most powerful ways to articulate that peril is through miscegenation. Okay, so miscegenation is a taboo. So one of the most potent aspects of these yellow peril discourses is the sexual danger of contact between the races. Although the power of the lascivious Asian woman to seduce the white male has long been part of this fantasy, and we'll talk more about that in the following weeks, a far more common scenario involves the threat posed by the Asian male to the white woman. These fantasies tend to link together national, cultural, and personal fears so that the rape of the white woman, so trigger warning, we are talking about rape, I'm sorry about that, I'll put a trigger warning in the description too, okay, of the white woman becomes a metaphor for the threat posed to Western culture, as well as a rationalization of Euro-American imperial adventures in Asia. So when you see these scenes, right, of this kind of woman who's about to get, possibly going to get raped by, this lecherous African American, or I don't know, black, I guess, or let's just be clear, a white man dressed up in blackface in a Union soldier costume made 100 or 50, 60 years later, okay, is a metaphor for that peril, for that threat. Okay, and it's a way of well, I don't know if Marchetti would agree that it's melodrama, but I would say that it's a melodramatic way of making that fear and that anxiety more kind of intensified, because people enjoy feeling afraid, and they enjoy that feeling of kind of like, okay, the feeling is enjoyable to feel threatened, okay, and scared, and that anxiety, okay? All right. So what are the sort of narrative patterns, all right? So both Marchetti and Greene do something that's really important, and that makes it more like film studies scholarship and historical scholarship, is they look at a lot of films and they look at it over a period of history in order to make that argument. It's much more rigorous, okay? So Marchetti, talks about what is the reason why we have these very, very racist, depictions, right? So she argues, similarly, Hollywood's interest in all types of taboo sexuality, in this case miscegenation, cannot be traced to a single root cause. Rather, Hollywood returns to this theme for complex reasons that seem to be related to economic, social, and cultural issues that have been part of the fabric of American history since well before the birth of the motion picture industry. Okay, so this has always been an issue. One of them, on the most obvious and superficial level, Hollywood returns to miscegenation narratives because they sell. Okay, you make money from them. Beyond their commercial appeal, however, these films very efficiently use classical Hollywood narrative patterns to deal with issues ranging from racism to changing attitudes towards gender and class relations. Okay, so these narrative patterns come up again and again and again, and I would say that many of them are melodramatic. Okay, they come up again and again as a way to negotiate and kind of articulate these changing ideologies, okay? So now today, maybe you might have a film that is melodramatic, but in that case, the racial melodrama is seen as a sort of, positive thing. And the bad guy is the white guy who learns to be good, right? And learns not to be racist or something like that. Like, the best picture winner of like 10, 15 years ago, what was it? Crash, which beat out Brokeback Mountain, okay? All right, so, one of the narrative patterns that Marchetti talks about and Broken Blossoms is the rape fantasy. Okay, so the narrative pattern most often associated with Hollywood dramas involving yellow peril features the rape or threat of rape of a Caucasian woman by a villainous Asian man. With roots deep within the Euro-American melodramatic tradition, these fantasies present the white woman as the innocent object of lust and token of the fragility of the West's own sense of moral purity. So this is key, right? Like when it comes to Broken Blossoms, the yellow man or whatever does not rape the young girl, but there is that threat. There is that sense of fear that it could happen, okay? And so they're not allowed to, it would not, I don't know, maybe it would, probably not, okay? It would not have been a popular film if they actually did have sex, okay? If they actually get together, okay? But the threat that they could get together, is something that gets kind of dealt with and kind of kept throughout, right? And another thing too is that, and here's the thing, this is kind of what's really, really interesting about this, right? Is that it's not just that it's saying like, oh, it's very, very threatening, and it's bad that a yellow man could, violate a white woman and therefore violate, white men everywhere, right? But it's also that the white woman, if she actually desires to be with the yellow man, must be punished. Okay, so in Broken Blossoms, why is it that the father, the brute or whatever, kills his daughter? It's even though she doesn't act, and she's like, I'm innocent. I didn't. We didn't do anything. He just protected me or whatever, right? He kills her, not because they actually did do it, but it's because it is possible that she wanted to. Okay, and that's key, right? So the fact that she might want to be defiled, she too must be punished in this sort of melodrama. Okay, so however, these tales often point to a contradictory suspicion that the masochistic virgin may secretly desire her defilement. Much of the raw violence of these narratives, then, involves not only the eradication of the threat of racial otherness by lynching the Asian rapist, but also the brutal punishment of the white woman through both the spectacle of her assault and the humiliation of her rescue. Okay, and so it's very important that in something like Broken Blossoms, everyone dies. Okay, so like everyone is evil, or everyone is bad, or they could be bad. So everyone must die. Okay, so the father gets shot, the daughter gets killed by the father, and because the yellow man, can't live without the daughter, and has done something which is really bad, which is murder a white man, and he kills himself. Okay, so everyone must be punished in some sort of way. Okay, and the kind of larger argument that Marchetti makes, okay, is that it's not just about race; it's about patriarchy. It's about how the sort of way of keeping score, and this is something that Anne McClintock talks about. But the way that a nation, or at least in the popular imagination, especially when you do it through these kind of feelings, okay, this is not I don't know if this like I wouldn't say that this is some sort of rational political discourse, okay, but the way that at least in the popular imagination, especially in a simplified thing like a melodrama, in popular culture, the way that these men understand their relationship to each other is by using women as bargaining chips. Okay, so it's like trading in women. So it's like the way that you can understand the superiority or the inferiority of one ethnic, one racial group, right? The white man versus the yellow man. The way that they articulate their sort of position with each other is through the bargaining chip of the woman. Okay, so the white woman becomes the sort of currency through which an Asian man or a white man in popular culture, in a movie, right, articulate their superiority or inferiority. Okay, and you also kind of see, and so the fact that a white woman might secretly desire to be with a yellow man instead of a white man means that she also must be punished, right? So ultimately, these kind of racial differences are negotiated through patriarchal norms. So this is very important for Marchetti's argument, is that there's an intersection of gender and race to these depictions, and that racial superiority is navigated through sexism, okay, and the kind of bargaining in women, okay. So this is very important to understand, and it's very key to my own scholarship as well. And it's a big reason why it's like when people ask us like how can you talk about cinema, and why do you have to talk about gender, why do you have to talk about race? Well, it's such an intrinsic part of cinema and Hollywood, that's been part of it since its very beginnings, right? We just talked about two films, one from 1915, right? From the very earliest cinema, already you see this intersection of the ways that women are used as racial negotiations, okay? So the other films I ask you to watch include, I wanted you to include The Bitter Tea of General Yen, okay? So you can watch that as well, and that's also interesting too, because it's like can a Chinese general be sexy, right? And is there and allowed to consummate the relationship. But the thing is too is that it's never so black and white as a melodrama makes it out to be, okay? Because there's also a sort of, if it weren't for that tension and that kind of desire for the other, for that defilement, for that understanding of the exotic difference, you wouldn't get that excitement. It's like playing with fire, right? Like the fire is dangerous and ultimately it needs to be put out. But still, when you go to the movies, you want to play with it too, okay? And that's kind of how melodrama works, especially, Hollywood melodrama. And so that's why a lot of these discourses get incorporated. So when you're understanding this, then you need to think about it through that sort of nuanced lens, okay? It's not enough just to say that, Hollywood is racist, Hollywood is sexist. It's like, how do these patterns work, and why do they work in that way? Okay. All right. So that's it for this week's lecture. If you have more questions, please post them in the forums, and we'll try to talk about it more. I know we covered a lot this week, and I know we still didn't get to the good earth, but I'll try to talk more about the good earth when we talk about I guess when we talk about ornamental Asia, okay? Because this one I'm going to talk more about the representations of Asian women. Okay, this week I talked a little bit about representation of Asian men, and the yellow peril and this relationship to sex and gender. Next week, our next lecture, which will be on March 4th, okay? I'll talk more about Asian women, okay? And a really interesting essay that's really new, I suggest you pick up, or I really recommend you read, is Anne Cheng's Ornamentalism, A Feminist Theory for the Yellow Woman. So this is a very interesting kind of new type of reading. Okay, and new type of argument, and look how she's saying ornamentalism. It's very, very close to this idea of Orientalism, right? At least they're not homophones, but they're similar in sound, right? And it's kind of interesting. So I think she's doing some interesting work there. Okay, all right. So let's try to follow up. Okay, so you've got 2 weeks where classes are canceled, and I'm not going to be posting any lectures. I ask that you do all the readings. I know you got to catch up. Okay. And also, I want you to get started on your cultural criticism. So midterm assignment. So if you have any questions about that, post in the forums. Okay. But, read through some of these examples. Okay. Just remember, it's due on March 25th. Okay. So I hope that you have enough time to do it. That's it for this week. And I will talk to you in a couple weeks, and hopefully soon we'll get to see you in person. Okay. That's it. Bye.